I have ridden through dust storms that turned the sky the color of dried blood. I have slept beside men who died before morning and woke to find their boots still warm. I have done things on the frontier that I do not write down, not because I am ashamed, but because paper is permanent and some moments deserve to dissolve. But what happened at the Harlan Ranch in the autumn of 1887, I write down, every word of it. Because if I don't, I am afraid I will convince myself it never happened. I am afraid I will ride back into the ordinary world and forget that I once stood in a doorway watching a woman I did not know hold a life I had no right to disturb, and feel, for the first time in 11 years on the frontier, that I was the one who did not belong. They say the ranch had been empty for years. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about most things, as it turned out. The smell hit me before the door did. Not rot, not the usual surrender of an abandoned place, that particular stench of wood giving itself back to the earth, of mice and damp and forgotten things. This was something else. Smoke, yes, but would smoke with something underneath it, something green and medicinal. Sage, maybe, or something I didn't have a name for, something alive. I remember stopping with my hand raised to push the door and just standing there. My horse, Clem, had already told me something was wrong. He told me 3 times on the approach. A head shake near the creek, a sideways step at the gate post, a full stop 40 yards from the porch that no amount of heel would move him past. I tied him to the post and walked the rest on foot, which I now understood was the only reason I was still breathing calmly rather than having been thrown into the dirt by a panicked animal. The door wasn't locked. That was the first thing. Jedediah Harlan had been dead for 6 years, trampled in Tucson, people said, though I'd always suspected drink had more to do with it than horses, and the ranch had sat untouched since. The county had stopped bothering to ride out and check on it after the first 2 winters. There was nothing to check on. Empty building, empty land. Nothing out here but red dirt, and the occasional coyote using the porch as a windbreak. I had come because a water line needed following. Simple survey work for the territory assessor, a man named Purvis who paid in cash and asked no follow-up questions, which suited me fine. I kept a log of every job I did for Purvis, mostly because I didn't trust my memory and partly because I liked the ritual of it. Morning and evening, 10 minutes with the journal. It kept me honest with myself, which was something the frontier had a way of making you stop being if you weren't deliberate about it. My log entry for that morning read, October 14, clear sky, Harlan property. Check water access, map creek deviation back before dark. Simple routine, then I pushed the door. The room inside was lit by a fire that had no business being there. It was a low fire, built in the old iron grate on the east wall, and it had been built carefully, the kind of fire that gives heat without giving much smoke, the kind that says someone here knows what they're doing and also does not want to be seen. The smoke I'd smelled was real but thin, curling up through the half-rusted chimney in a pale thread that wouldn't draw the eye at any distance. The room itself had been remade. Not repaired, remade. The broken window on the south wall had been covered with a piece of cured hide, sewn flat across the frame with sinew in tight, even stitches. The floor had been swept clean. Not simply cleared of debris, actually swept, with something recently enough that the marks were still visible in the dust. Bundles of dried plant matter hung from the ceiling beams, 4 of them evenly spaced, each tied with a different color of cord. A clay pot sat near the fire, and from it came the smell I hadn't been able to name, something green and sharp that was not quite sage, and not quite anything I knew from 6 years on the frontier. I stood in the doorway, and my hand went to my holster. And then I saw her. She was sitting in the far corner, in the shadow the firelight didn't reach, and she was watching me with an expression that I cannot now describe as anything other than tired. Not afraid. Not aggressive. Tired in the way a person is tired when something they have been anticipating for a long time has finally arrived, and they no longer have the energy to feel anything complicated about it. She was Apache. I knew that immediately, not from any one thing but from everything together, the shape of her face, the clothes, the stillness with which she sat, a kind of absolute physical quiet that white women on the frontier rarely had because white women on the frontier rarely had the luxury of it. She looked to be in her mid-30s, though the frontier had a way of making that number meaningless. She was lean. Her hands were in her lap, visible, which I would later understand was a deliberate choice. She said something I didn't catch. I said, I don't, and stopped because I didn't know how to finish that sentence honestly. I don't speak Apache. I don't mean you harm. I don't understand what's happening. All of those were true. None of them seemed adequate. She said it again, slower, and this time I caught a single word in it that I recognized from 2 years of working near the San Carlos boundary. Something that meant approximately wait. So I waited. She stood slowly, the way people stand when they want you to see that they're not reaching for anything, and crossed the room toward a door on the north wall, a back room I hadn't seen. She stopped at the door, looked at me once more with that same exhausted steadiness, and pushed it open. From the back room came a sound that rearranged everything in my chest. An infant, small new with the particular high-pitched wavering cry that very young babies have, the kind that sounds like a question and an accusation at the same time. The woman disappeared through the door. The crying settled briefly into the wet sounds of feeding. I did not move. I was aware suddenly and acutely of how large I was, of the gun on my hip, of my boots on the swept floor, of the dust I'd tracked in. I was aware of myself as a thing in that room, a presence with weight and danger attached to it whether I intended it or not, and the awareness sat on me like a hand pressing down. 3 minutes passed, maybe 4. I counted them by the fire's small pops. Then the woman came back through the door, and behind her came 3 others. The second woman was older, I'd put her at 50, maybe more, with gray threaded through her hair and a face that had clearly stopped caring what you thought of it about 2 decades ago. She carried herself with the specific gravity of someone who has been the person others turn to in a crisis so many times that the posture has become permanent. She looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient, assessing, not unkind, but fundamentally unsentimental. The third was young, 18, 19, and she was the only one who showed me anything like fear. Her eyes were large and dark, and they moved between me and the door behind me with a rhythm that said measuring distance, measuring distance, measuring distance. She had a long scratch along her left forearm, dried to a brown crust, and her hands wouldn't stop moving, braiding and unbraiding a piece of cord she'd pulled from her sleeve. The fourth, I didn't notice her at first, which I later realized had been intentional. She'd positioned herself in the back corner near the window hide, half behind a beam, in the exact spot where the firelight created a gap in its reach. She was perhaps 30, solidly built, and she was watching me with the particular quality of attention that, on the frontier, you learn to recognize. The attention of someone who has already decided what they will do if it comes to that, and is simply waiting to see if it will. I took my hand off the holster. I moved it slowly and deliberately to my chest, palm flat, which felt like the least ambiguous thing I could do with it. The older woman said something, short. The young one with the cord stopped moving her hands. The one in the corner didn't shift, but something in her shoulders dropped a single degree. I want to tell you that I understood immediately, that my instincts were right, my heart was open, my judgment was clear. That would be a lie, and I made a promise to myself that this account would not contain lies. What I felt, standing in that room with 4 Apache women, and the sound of an infant breathing through the wall, was afraid. Not of them exactly, or not only of them, but of the wrongness of the situation, the way it sat outside every category I had for understanding my own life. I was a survey man. I worked alone. I had 11 years of careful distance between myself and anything complicated, and now I was standing in a dead man's ranch house watching an old Apache woman assess me with the detachment of someone pricing livestock, and I had absolutely no idea what came next. My personal failing in moments of confusion is that I write things down, I know, but I reached for my journal. I don't know what made me do it. Habit, maybe, or some scrambled instinct that said, make yourself legible, make yourself something they can read. I opened it slowly, showing the cover first, the pen, the pages, and I pointed to the words I'd written that morning. October 14, Harlan property. Then I pointed to myself and made a broad gesture that I hoped conveyed something like, I'm just here about the water. The older woman looked at the journal for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Then she said 4 words I couldn't parse, turned her back and walked to the fire to stir the pot. I took that as permission to breathe. I found out later, much later, and through a process I will describe in the next part, that they had been in the ranch for 11 days. 11 days. They'd come up from the south off a route that wasn't supposed to exist, that the army didn't know about and the territory assessors hadn't mapped because it ran through a canyon that all the old surveys listed as impassable. It wasn't impassable. It was just brutal, and 11 days ago it had been one thing more than that. It had been necessary. I didn't know any of this yet. What I knew in that first hour was what I could observe. They were not hiding from me. That was the most disorienting thing. Once the initial moment had passed, once I had put my hand to my chest and stood still long enough to be read, they went back to what they'd been doing before I arrived. The young one resumed something I eventually realized was repair work on a piece of tack, a strap dried stiff that she was working back to suppleness with some kind of oil. The corner woman, the watchful one, unwound herself from the beam and went to the back room, and I heard the baby's soft sounds take on a different quality. The older woman tended the pot. Only the first woman I'd seen, the one who'd been sitting when I arrived, stayed near me. She sat down on the floor 4 feet away and looked at me steadily, and I had the sensation of being studied in good faith, which is different from being studied in suspicion. She was trying to figure out what I was, not what I would do, what I was. I opened my journal and wrote, "Do not make sudden movements. Do not reach for anything. Breathe slowly." Then I crossed out the last line because it felt ridiculous and just sat with the book open in my lap, pen in my hand, the way I always did when I was thinking. She watched the pen move. Her expression shifted, not much, but enough. I wrote a few more lines, nothing consequential, just the description of the room, the bundles, the fire. I held the journal so she could see the marks on the page. She looked at the marks for a long time. Then she reached into the fold of her garment and produced something, a small piece of flat bark, worn smooth on one side. On the smooth side were marks, not quite like my writing, not the pictographic style I'd seen in government documents labeled primitive, but something else entirely, something structured and purposeful. She held it toward me the way I'd held the journal toward her. "Even exchange, you showed me yours." I looked at her marks and I could not read them, and I told her so with a headshake. She looked at my journal and I understood she was telling me the same thing. And somehow, I don't know how, it doesn't make complete sense when I write it out, that established something. The acknowledgement of mutual illegibility. Neither of us could read the other, and we'd both said so plainly. And now we were sitting on the floor of a dead man's ranch, and the fire was warm, and the baby in the back room had gone quiet again. The afternoon moved slowly. Twice the watchful corner woman came to the door of the back room and looked at me. Twice I stayed still and met her eyes and didn't move. On the second look she held it longer before going back inside, and I thought I might have been wrong, that the quality of it had shifted slightly. Still watchful, still ready, but less like she was counting down and more like she was just keeping account. The young one with the cord spoke once, a quick burst of words directed at the first woman, who answered with something short. I caught the woman's eyes briefly, and she made a small gesture with one hand, flat level, that I interpreted as "it's fine." I might have been projecting, but I wrote it down. Around what I judged to be mid-afternoon, the older woman dipped a clay cup into the pot and held it toward me. I want to be honest about what happened in the next 3 seconds, because I think it matters. I hesitated. Not long, maybe a count of 2, but she saw it, and she lowered the cup 1 inch, and I watched her face not change, and I understood that she had already lived through 1,000 versions of that particular hesitation, and that she would not offer twice. I reached forward and took the cup. It was hot, and it was the green sharp thing I'd smelled all afternoon, some kind of broth or infusion that tasted like the high desert in autumn, which is to say it tasted like something being preserved against its will. I drank it. It burned going down in a way that felt almost medicinal. I didn't know what was in it. I wrote "drank it anyway" in my journal and moved on. The older woman watched me drink with an expression I could only interpret as professional. Checking for reaction, maybe, watching my color. I held steady, and she returned to the fire and said nothing. I stayed until the light outside the window hide turned orange. Then I stood slowly and picked up my pack and my journal, and I looked at the first woman, the one who'd been sitting when I came, the one who'd shown me the bark, and I tried to put something in my expression that matched what I felt, which was approximately, "I'm going. I'm not bringing anyone back. I'm not going to explain this to anyone tonight." I don't know if she read it that way. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something quiet, and the thing she said had the rhythm of a sentence that ends with the name of something important. I didn't know the word, but I said my own name, Fletcher, Cal Fletcher, and pointed to my chest. She said her name. I couldn't hold all the sounds of it the first time. She said it again, and I repeated it back badly, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not a laugh. The young one's cord work paused for a moment. I walked out into the late afternoon. Clem was still at the post, head low, ears tracking me as I came across the yard. I untied him and stood there a moment with my hand on his neck, looking back at the ranch house. The smoke was barely visible now. If you weren't looking for it, if you hadn't already been inside, you'd have ridden past this place 100 times and seen nothing. I mounted up and turned south. I wrote nothing in my log that night, not a word, just the date and then 3 inches of blank. That blank is still there. I've never gone back to fill it in. I went back the next morning because I told myself I was going back for the water survey. That was not entirely untrue. Purvis expected measurements. But I had spent the night on the hard ground by a creek I wasn't actually measuring, staring at the dark and running through what I'd seen, and by first light I had admitted to myself that the water was a reason, not the reason. The reason was something I didn't have clean words for yet, something that sat at the center of me and wouldn't resolve into anything I recognized. I wrote in my morning log, October 15, returning to Harlan property. Water survey incomplete. Then I added, because the blank from the night before was bothering me, there are people inside, 4 women and an infant. I did not report this yesterday. I am not certain I will report it today. The act of writing it made it more real and also more committed. I snapped the journal shut. Clem was less resistant this time, which I chose to read as a good sign. The smoke was already going when I crested the low rise above the creek, the same thin thread, the same careful ratio of heat to visibility. I stopped on the rise and watched it for a few minutes, the way you watch a fire when you've had time to think about what it means. Someone had tended it through the night. Someone was awake before dawn and had enough confidence in the situation to keep the fire burning. I took that as something, though I wasn't sure what. This time I knocked. I don't know why. The door wasn't locked yesterday either. But it felt right, the distinction between entering and arriving, maybe. The frontier had a way of collapsing that distinction, and it usually wasn't the collapse that went well for anyone. There was a pause, then the door opened. The corner woman. Up close, she was more substantial than she'd seemed yesterday, broad through the shoulders in a way that said practical work, not weight. Her face was younger than I'd estimated from across the room. 30, maybe less. She looked at me with the same ledger-quality attention as before, but the countdown I'd felt yesterday was absent. She'd made a decision somewhere in the night, and it hadn't been kill him, or I'd have known already. She stepped back from the door. I came inside. The setup had changed overnight in ways that told a story. The bundles on the ceiling had been rearranged. 2 moved closer to the fire, 2 pulled back. The clay pot had been cleaned and refilled, and there was now a second pot beside it, smaller with a different smell. Someone had repaired a crack in the old grate with what looked like packed clay mixed with ash, the kind of repair that would hold for weeks if you maintained the fire correctly. The swept floor had been swept again. The baby was visible for the first time. The corner woman, I would learn her name later. I will use it when I get there, had brought the infant to the main room, wrapped in a piece of tightly woven cloth. It was very small. Not dangerously small, I didn't think, but recently arrived small. The kind of compact, raisin-faced small that made it hard to believe the person would ever be any size other than this. The first woman, the one who'd shown me the bark, was sitting near the fire. She nodded when I came in, which I took as acknowledgement. Not welcome, exactly. Acknowledgement. I was a fact that had been incorporated. The older woman was in the back room. I could hear her moving. The young one was visible through the doorway, asleep on her side, the scratched arm pressed against her chest. I found a spot near the door and sat. The corner woman put the baby down on a folded cloth and went to the second pot and tasted something from her finger and frowned. She added something from a pouch at her waist. I couldn't see what and tasted again, and her expression didn't change, but she tasted a third time, which I interpreted as meaning it was closer. She was competent in the way that people are competent when they have had to be, consistently, over a long period of time, without acknowledgement. I watched her move around that room and I thought about the word efficient, and then I thought the word wasn't quite right because efficiency implies a removal of the unnecessary, and everything she did looked necessary. There was no waste in it. There was also no performance of it. She just did the things and moved to the next things. After a while she came and sat near me, not as close as the first woman had yesterday, but not at the far end of the room either. She looked at my pack and then looked at me, and I understood she was asking if I had something. I did have something. I'd brought it deliberately, and I'd spent 20 minutes that morning arguing with myself about whether it was a good idea. In my pack I had two things I'd been carrying for the survey: a supply of hard biscuits, which kept well, and a small tin of salt pork that Purvis's supply wagon had overstocked. I hadn't eaten much of either. Frontier work had not made me a large appetite man. I opened the pack and held them out. She looked at them for a moment, then she said something over her shoulder to the first woman. The first woman replied. The corner woman looked back at me and took the tin and the biscuits. Not eagerly, not gratefully, or at least not in a way that asked me to see the gratitude. She took them the way you take something that's been offered in good faith and is useful and will be used. The exchange acknowledged and completed and moved past. I wrote in my journal, gave them what I had. It wasn't much, it was something. The morning passed. It passed in a way I found difficult to describe in the journal because nothing happened exactly, and everything happened. The fire burned. The baby slept and woke and was fed and slept again. The older woman emerged from the back room and moved around the main room with the same clinical authority and said very little to anyone. The young one woke around what I judged to be late morning and came to the doorway and looked at me, and then looked at the first woman, who said something. And the young one exhaled through her nose and came into the main room and sat down. She was in worse shape than I'd noticed yesterday. The scratch on her arm wasn't a scratch. It was a cut that had been cleaned and packed but not closed, and it had the redness around it that said the packing was doing most of the work against something that wanted to go another direction. The older woman checked it twice in the hour that followed, once pressing firmly at the edges in a way that made the young one go very still, and once repacking it with something from the green-smelling supply. The young one did not make a sound during either check. She sat with her free hand flat on her knee and her jaw set at an angle that said she was handling it. I watched this without staring, I hope. I wrote in my journal, she's injured. The arm, been treated probably for a day or more, holding. Around midday, the first woman moved to sit beside me. She had the bark with her again, the flat piece with the marks, and this time she had something else, a stick with a sharpened end worn smooth in the grip. She used the point to indicate one of the marks on the bark. Then she pointed south. I understood that she was showing me something about where they'd come from, and I nodded. She made a gesture with the stick, not one direction but a path south, then curving west, then up. The shape of a route. I opened my journal to the blank map page I kept for surveying and held it toward her, with the pen. She looked at the pen, she looked at me. Then she took it carefully, holding it the way you hold something you're not certain of, and she made a mark on the map page. A line, south, then the curve, then a mark that I eventually understood was a specific feature, high ground, I thought, or water. She handed the pen back. I added to her line, extending the north end to show the ranch, and then, because I'm a survey man and I cannot help it, I marked the creek and the canyon system to the east. She looked at what I'd added. She took the pen back and made a correction to the canyon marks, shifted one of them west, added another I hadn't placed. We went back and forth like this for 20 minutes, building a map that neither of us could have made alone. I want to say it felt historic. It didn't. It felt strangely ordinary, like any two people working a problem from different ends. She knew things I didn't, and I knew things she didn't, and the map on the page got more accurate with each pass. When we stopped mutually by unspoken agreement, she ran her finger along the route they'd traveled, south to where we were. 11 days, though I didn't know the number yet. She made a different gesture, palm down, moving in a forward direction. Continuing. I looked at the route on the map. North and west, past the ranch, into territory that I knew from Purvis's surveys was currently heavily patrolled. I looked at her. She looked back at me with that same tired, steady quality, not asking, informing. She was telling me what was going to happen, not requesting permission for it. I turned back to the map and I added what I knew. Patrol routes marked with small crosses. A gap I'd noticed 3 weeks ago between two overlapping jurisdictions. A seam in the territory coverage that a careful traveler could use. I marked it clearly. She studied it for a long moment. Then she made a sound, single syllable, not quite a word in anything I knew, that I filed mentally as noted. The baby woke with a particular quality of cry, and the corner woman was through the doorway before the sound had finished, which told me something about the nature of attention she'd been maintaining all morning while seeming to work. I had to recalibrate my estimate of her. She was not the quiet one. She was the one who had decided that quiet was tactically appropriate and was executing it with absolute discipline. I heard her voice through the wall, low and steady, and the cry settled. I heard the rhythm of it, the specific cadence of someone soothing a very new thing, and it did something to the quality of the air in the room. The older woman stood still by the fire for a moment, listening, and then went back to her work. The first woman's hands, I noticed, had stopped their small movements. The young one was looking at the doorway. Her expression was a complex thing, layered in ways that I wasn't positioned to fully read. Worry, yes, but underneath the worry, something possessive and fierce that was entirely at odds with her age and the way she'd been sitting carefully in the corner. That look said that if something went wrong in the next room, she would get up despite the arm, and she'd keep getting up, and the arm would be a problem for later. I wrote, "The baby belongs to someone in this room. I don't know who. It doesn't matter right now." I crossed out the last sentence because it did matter, and I was being cowardly about it. I wrote instead, "The baby belongs to someone, and that someone is here, and that changes what this is." By mid-afternoon, I had been in the ranch for 5 hours, and I had not touched my gun, and nothing had happened that required me to, and I was beginning to have the strange sensation, one I didn't have a word for and couldn't find one in the journal, of having been subtly redefined. Not transformed, that's a word people use too easily. Redefined, moved to a slightly different position relative to things I thought I understood. I knew the territory. I knew the survey maps, the patrol patterns, the water access, the political situation from Fort Apache to Tucson. I knew what the newspapers said, and what the Army communicated through Purvis's secondary contacts, and what the other survey men said around fires at night. I knew the framework. What I had not known, what I was now sitting inside of, was the inside. Here was what was actually true. 4 women and an infant had covered an impossible route in 11 days through country that men with horses and supplies regularly failed to navigate. They had established a functional shelter with fire and medicine, and food preparation and ventilation and concealment, in a space that offered almost none of those things to begin with. They had maintained all of this while one of them was injured, and one of them had given birth recently enough that she shouldn't have been moving at all. They had done this without me, without anyone. And now they were going to continue north and west through a seam in the patrol coverage that I had just shown them. And they were going to do that too. And the only question that was actually in my hands was whether or not I was going to do anything in the morning that altered the equation. I sat with that question as the light shifted in the window hide. The first woman was watching me. I had the sense she knew what I was sitting with. She didn't say anything. She just watched with that tired steadiness and let me arrive at wherever I was going to arrive. When the light went orange, I stood to leave. The corner woman came out of the back room as I was picking up my pack. She looked at me with the ledger attention again, and then she said something, 3 or 4 words, to the first woman. The first woman answered 1 word. The corner woman looked back at me, and she reached into her garment and produced something small, which she held toward me in her palm. It was a piece of turquoise, not large, thumbnail-sized, but worked at one edge into a slight curve like the beginning of something. It might have been worn smooth by use. It might have been cut that way. I looked at it and then looked at her. She held it out further. I took it. I have it now in my left pocket, where I carry things I don't know what to do with. I have carried it every day since. I walked out into the evening and rode south, and I told no one that night. And in the morning I made a decision that I wrote down in 3 words before I could talk myself out of it. On the 3rd morning, I brought as much as I could carry without making it obvious that I was carrying it. I want to be plain about the calculation I was making, because I think honesty about this matters more than making myself look good in the account. What I was doing was not legal, under the frameworks that existed in 1887 by the people who held the authority to define legal. I was aware of this. I was not naive about what it meant. I was also aware, and this is the part that I have never fully explained to anyone who asked me about that week, because it requires more context than a campfire conversation allows, that the frameworks and the people were not, in this specific situation, the same thing as right. That the gap between those two ideas was exactly the size of a swept floor and a thin smoke thread, and 4 women navigating by knowledge I didn't have. I had spent a long time on the frontier being a man who did the work and kept the accounts and didn't get into the gap. I was good at staying out of the gap. I was efficient about it. October 15th, I had stepped into the gap, and I could feel the edge of it under my boots, and it was too late to step back without it meaning something deliberate. So I brought what I could carry, and I rode north. Clem walked the whole approach without resistance. I had been keeping my own informal account of this, the horse's behavior as a kind of emotional barometer, and the willingness of his walk felt significant in the way that small things accumulate significance over 3 days of paying close attention. I tied him at the post, and he dropped his head and rested without fuss, which was as much permission as Clem ever gave anyone to do anything. I knocked. The door opened immediately, the first woman. She looked at the pack and then at my face, and her expression did something I hadn't seen from her in 2 days of close observation. It became briefly, specifically human in the way that tired people become briefly human when something they weren't expecting turns out to be better than the alternative. She stepped back from the door. The young one was standing. This was the first time I'd seen her on her feet, and it mattered immediately, because she was taller than I'd estimated, and she was holding herself differently than yesterday. Not the careful stillness of pain management, but the careful stillness of someone who had made a decision about what they were going to be in this room, and was maintaining it by will. Her arm had been redressed. Cleaner wrapped tighter with the ends tucked in a way that said practice. She was watching me come in with the large dark eyes and the measuring quality, and this time the measuring had a different flavor. She wasn't calculating the door anymore. She was calculating me. I set the pack down near the fire and opened it and put the contents on the floor. More biscuits, a slab of dried venison I'd traded for at the creek crossing 2 weeks ago and been carrying for emergency use. A small wrapped parcel of dried fruit that Purvis's wagon had included for reasons I'd never asked about. And the thing I'd been uncertain about, a glass bottle of whiskey, 3/4 full, that I carried for wound treatment and had never used for anything else. I pointed to the bottle and made a clear gesture toward the young woman's arm. The first woman translated this, I assumed, with a few words to the room. The older woman came from the fire and looked at the bottle and said something. The first woman said something back. The older woman looked at me with a quality of consideration that I can only describe as professional parity. The same consideration she'd have given a colleague with an idea she wasn't sure about, and then she held out her hand. I gave her the bottle. She opened it and smelled it and made a sound that might have been dismissive or might have been satisfied, and took it to the back room. I heard the young one's slight intake of breath a few minutes later, and then silence, and then she came back to the doorway with her arm rewrapped and an expression that was not quite controlled and not quite not controlled. Somewhere in the middle, held steady by the same will I'd noticed before. The older woman re-emerged with the bottle, now less full. She handed it back to me. The exchange was complete and matter-of-fact, and I found I didn't want to write anything in the journal about it. Some things lose something when you try to hold them with words. The corner woman had the baby in the main room again. The infant was more alert today, eyes open, tracking the light and the fire with the unfocused attention of new things encountering the world for the first time. The corner woman held it in the crook of her left arm with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, and with her right hand she was doing something I watched for several minutes before I understood. She was showing it things. Slowly, deliberately, she moved her free hand into the infant's line of sight, held it, moved it, held it again, turned her wrist. The infant's unfocused gaze dragged after the movement in the fitful, magnetically distracted way of new eyes. She was teaching it to see. I have thought about that image many times since, and each time I think about it, I land somewhere different. What it means about patience, what it means about the future being a thing you build in small, deliberate gestures. What it means about hope, which is a word I am usually careful about, but which seems like the right one for a woman in a borrowed, half-repaired room showing a new infant how to follow the light. I wrote exactly 3 words, she is teaching. Then I closed the journal, because I didn't trust myself to write anything else accurately. Midday brought a shift in the weather that I felt before I heard or saw it. The fire's smoke backed slightly, pressure change. the kind that precedes rain in that part of the territory. I said something, to no one in particular, about the rain, and the first woman looked up and then went to the window hide and pressed her hand flat against it, feeling the air pressure change through the cured skin. She said something to the older woman. The older woman said something back, the same word twice. The young one spoke for the first time directly to me. Short, clipped, she was pointing at the window hide and then at the ceiling. I understood she was asking about the roof. I had been a survey man, and I had been in plenty of abandoned buildings, and I knew what bad roofing looked like when you were about to ask it to hold a serious amount of rain. I stood and looked up and I said, "The east section is thin," and pointed. She couldn't understand the words, but she followed the point and she looked at the section, and she made a sound that said she'd already noticed this and was waiting to see if I had. Then she was moving. What followed was the most practical hour I had spent with another person in 11 years. The young one directed it. I don't know how else to say it. She moved through that room with the focused authority of someone who has assessed a problem, knows what needs doing, and is not interested in any conversation about hierarchy. She pointed to me and then to the east beam. She pointed to the first woman and to the supply area near the fire. She pointed to the older woman and made a gesture I didn't fully follow. But the older woman went to the back room and came back with something I hadn't seen before. A roll of tightly woven material, rough textured, dark with some kind of treatment. Waterproofing. They'd been carrying waterproofing material. The young one unrolled it with her good arm and her teeth and measured a length against the ceiling with her eyes, not guessing, measuring, and tore a clean section. She handed it to me and pointed up. I climbed the beam with the material, and she stood below and directed me with hand signals. Left, back, forward, stop. When I had it positioned, she went and pressed on it from the underside with a stick to feel the coverage, and she redirected me twice and then held up a flat palm. There. We secured it at 4 points. The first woman held one corner on a long stick while I tied the others. The older woman passed materials from below with the efficiency of long practice. The corner woman did not put the baby down. She held the infant throughout and managed to pass a piece of cord to me one-handed at exactly the moment I needed it without anyone asking her to, which was a kind of attention to the room that I found difficult to account for. By the time the rain came, and it came hard, sheeting in from the south, the east section was covered. The rest of the roof held. The fire stayed lit. We sat together in the sound of the rain, and no one said anything. And the silence was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have just done a thing together and are resting in the completion of it. In the late afternoon, the first woman moved to sit beside me with the bark and the map page. The route we'd mapped yesterday was more urgent now. The rain would give cover for 2 days, maybe 3, but the ground after rain would be different. Some of the canyon routes better, some worse. She was tracing the route again, and I was following, and we were both making small adjustments based on what the other knew. She asked me something. I could feel the question shape even without the language, and I looked at the map and I understood she was asking about the timing, when the patrol seam was least covered. I knew this. Purvis's records were specific about it. The 3rd week of October was a rotation month. There were 3 days, roughly the 18th to the 20th, when the Eastern Patrol was reliably late and the Western checkpoint was understaffed. The gap was widest in those 3 days. I counted on my fingers, October 15 today. 3 days. She watched my finger counting. She looked at the map. She looked at me. I held up 3 fingers and pointed north and west along the route. She looked at the 3 fingers for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not surprise, but a reassessment. She said a single word quietly, and the word had the quality of something that was both acknowledgement and conclusion. 3 days, they had 3 days to wait. The ranch could give them 3 days. The afternoon light, filtered through rain and the cured hide, gave the room a quality I haven't been able to describe well in the years since. Something amber, something close. The fire burned low and steady, and the rain was a continuous sound against the roof, including, I noticed, the patched east section, which held without complaint. And the people in that room moved in the small ways people move when they have stopped bracing for the next problem. Not relaxed. I want to be careful about that word. They were not relaxed. The corner woman's awareness of the room never dropped. The older woman checked the young one's arm every 2 hours with the same clinical attention. The first woman's eyes went to the window hide every time the rain shifted sound. But there was something different in the room, a different quality of alertness. The kind that can coexist with eating, with the ordinary small gestures of people sharing space. The young one showing the first woman something in the weave of the tack strap she'd been repairing. The older woman saying something dry that made the first woman exhale through her nose. The corner woman arranging the infant in the crook of her arm, so that its face was toward the fire's warmth. I sat in the corner by the door with my journal open and my pen in my hand, and I wrote almost nothing. I just sat in it. I have been a man who kept accounts. Counts, logs, measurements, maps. It was how I understood what was real. If I could write it down, it had happened. If I could write it down precisely, it had happened precisely. I found in that rainy afternoon that some of the most real things I had encountered in 11 years were not things I had managed to write down. Before I left, something happened that I want to get exactly right, because I've replayed it enough times that I'm afraid I've embroidered it, and I don't want it embroidered. The baby was awake and making the sounds that mean neither distress nor contentment, the small exploratory sounds of a creature encountering itself. The corner woman was holding it, and the first woman was nearby, and the young one crossed the room and stood over the baby and made a face. Not a deliberate face, a helpless one, the kind that happens to the muscles of people who are near very small children, whether they intend it or not. Brows up, mouth soft, the face a person makes when they have entirely forgotten to maintain their expression because something small is looking at them and they can't help it. The baby's unfocused gaze found her. The young one made a sound, short, bright, the kind of sound that happens before language underneath language, and the baby's mouth worked in the way that very new babies' mouths work. Not smiling, the face too new for a real smile, but something in the same direction. Something that was the biological early draft of a smile. The young one straightened up and put the measuring face back on and turned away, and she caught me watching, and for a moment we just looked at each other, and I think we both understood that we had witnessed something that belonged to afterward. To whatever came after the canyon and the patrol and the 3 days and the route on the map. Whatever that was going to be. I looked away first. I picked up my pack. I said goodbye to no one in particular and everyone at once, which is how you leave a room when you don't have the right words for any of the individual goodbyes. The first woman walked me to the door. She held it as I stepped out into the rain, still falling, lighter now, fine as smoke, and she said something, and I stopped on the porch and turned back. She was holding the piece of bark. She held it toward me. I looked at it and then at her. I didn't take it, it was hers. It was marked with things I couldn't read, but that were clearly a record of something, a route, a history, something that had been kept and mattered. I shook my head. She held it further. We were at an impasse for a moment, 2 people on either side of a door in the rain, each refusing something the other was trying to give. Then I understood. I took the bark. I opened my journal to the map page, the one we'd made together with her marks and mine. I tore it out carefully along the binding. I held it toward her. She looked at it, she looked at me, she took it. She said something, a sentence this time, full and deliberate, with the weight of something that had been thought about. I didn't understand any of it except for the rhythm, which was the rhythm of a thing being said plainly, without decoration. Then she let the door close. I rode south in the rain. I rode past the creek and past the canyon and past the place where my survey should have ended 3 days ago, and I did not stop until I reached the relay station at the edge of Purvis's territory, where a man I knew named Obel was keeping the fire against the weather. Obel asked me if the survey was done. I said water access confirmed, no other points of interest in the Harlan property area. He wrote it in his own log. I watched him write it. I thought about the thin smoke thread and the swept floor, and the map built out of 2 kinds of knowledge and the bark in my left pocket, and the sound of rain on a roof that had been patched to hold by a woman with an injured arm and a specific quality of will that I didn't have a word for in English, or in anything. Obel asked me why I was wet, and I said it rained, and he said yes it did and offered me coffee, and I took it and sat by his fire and said nothing further. I don't know what happened after I left. This is the honest end to the account, and I have made my peace with it mostly. I know what I did. I kept the survey report empty. I made no report to the army post, the territory office, or anyone with authority over anything. 3 days later, I found a reason, manufactured, thin, but sufficient, to be on survey work 60 miles north, which put me in the position of being able to observe, from a high ridge, nothing in particular. Which is what I observed. Nothing in particular. A road, a sky after rain. The ordinary ongoing landscape of a territory that was never as empty as it looked. I have the bark still. I have the turquoise still in the left pocket, taken out and looked at more times than I can count. The map page is gone, of course. It went with them wherever they went. All I have of it is the memory of making it, 2 people on a floor working a problem from different ends. Sometimes I try to reconstruct it from memory, in the journal. The lines never come out right. The canyon mark is always in the wrong place. I think that's appropriate. I think some maps only exist in the making of them, and then they belong to wherever they go, and you keep your end of it in the only place that can hold the parts that can't be written down. The first woman's name, I said it badly, she corrected it, I said it badly again. I have written my best phonetic attempt in the journal 7 times over the years. It's probably wrong in some way that matters. I say it occasionally anyway, when I'm alone, when the country looks a particular way in a particular light. The country doesn't answer, but saying it does something to me that I cannot fully account for, even now, even in this account that I made myself write because I was afraid of forgetting.